The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and neither had Margaret's tears. She sat alone in the corner booth of the Riverside Diner, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. At 73, she'd buried a husband, raised 3 children who'd scattered across the country like dandelion seeds, and somehow convinced herself that loneliness was just another season to endure. But tonight, on the anniversary of James's death, the weight of silence pressed against her chest like a stone, and she wondered if anyone in this entire city of 8 million souls would even notice if she simply disappeared. The diner was nearly empty. Just her, a tired waitress named Rosa who'd stopped asking if she needed a refill, and a young woman who'd rushed in 20 minutes ago, shaking rain from her dark hair and sliding into a booth near the window. Margaret watched her without meaning to, the way people observe strangers when their own lives feel too heavy to bear. The woman couldn't have been more than 30, dressed in scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon bears, the kind pediatric nurses wore. She was crying too, Margaret noticed, though she was trying hard to hide it, swiping at her eyes between bites of a sandwich she clearly wasn't tasting. Something about the sight cracked open a door in Margaret's chest, the one she'd kept carefully locked since James died. Before she could talk herself out of it, she was standing, her knees protesting, and walking across the black and white checkered floor. "I'm sorry to intrude," Margaret said softly, her voice rusty from disuse. "But I couldn't help noticing you might need a friend tonight. So do I." The young woman looked up, startled, her brown eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. For a moment, Margaret thought she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd be told politely to mind her own business. But then something shifted in the woman's expression, a wall coming down. A breath released. "Please," she said, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. "I'm Sarah." "Margaret." They sat in silence for a moment. 2 strangers, joined by tears and rain and the fluorescent hum of a late-night diner. Sarah picked at her sandwich, and Margaret noticed the tremor in her hands. "I lost a patient today," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A little girl. 7 years old, Amelia." She closed her eyes. "We did everything right. Everything by the book. But sometimes medicine isn't enough. And you're left standing there wondering what the hell any of it matters." Margaret reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with her own. She didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. She'd learned long ago that some pains couldn't be soothed with words. "My husband died 5 years ago today," Margaret said, "and I came here tonight because I didn't want to be alone in our apartment, surrounded by 47 years of memories and nothing but silence." She smiled sadly. "I think the universe might have known we both needed to not be alone." Something passed between them then, recognition perhaps, of the way grief binds strangers tighter than joy sometimes can. Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand, and for the first time in hours, maybe days, Margaret felt tethered to the world again. They talked until the diner closed at midnight. Sarah told Margaret about medical school, about the idealism that had carried her through, 80-hour weeks and crushing debt, about Amelia's mother collapsing in the hallway and how Sarah had held her while she screamed. Margaret told Sarah about James, about their first date at this very diner 60 years ago, about the garden they'd tended together and how she couldn't bear to look at it now, overgrown with weeds and memory. "Come home with me," Margaret said suddenly as Rosa flipped the sign to "closed." "I have a guest room, and you shouldn't be alone tonight either." Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. Margaret's apartment was exactly as Sarah had imagined, filled with photographs and soft lamplight, doilies on the arms of floral furniture, the faint scent of lavender and old books. But what caught her attention was the wall of frames in the hallway, pictures of 3 children at various ages, graduations and weddings and grandchildren. "When did you last see them?" Sarah asked gently. "Christmas. Cards at birthdays." Margaret's voice was steady, but Sarah heard the fracture beneath. "They have their own lives. I understand that, but understanding doesn't make it hurt less. They stayed up until 3 in the morning, drinking chamomile tea and trading stories." Sarah showed Margaret pictures of Amelia. Her patient's mother had given her permission to take one, a little girl with gap-toothed smile and pigtails, holding a stuffed elephant. Margaret showed Sarah James's purple heart from Korea, still in its case, still catching the light after all these years. "He was a hero," Sarah said. "He was scared every day of his life after that war," Margaret replied. "But he got up anyway. He showed up anyway. That's what heroism really is, I think. Not the absence of fear or pain, but the choice to keep going despite it." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "I needed to hear that tonight." As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah made a decision. She called in sick for the first time in 3 years, and instead of going home to her empty apartment to fall apart alone, she spent the day with Margaret. They walked to the community garden James had loved, and together they pulled weeds. Sarah's hands, trained to start IVs and check pulses, learned the rhythm of soil and root. Margaret's hands, stiff with arthritis, remembered the joy of nurturing growing things. By afternoon, they'd cleared half the plot, and Margaret was laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. "You know what we should plant?" Margaret said. "Sunflowers. James always said they were proof that even the plainest things could be extraordinary if they just reached for the light." They bought seeds at the corner store, and an elderly Korean man named Mr. Kim gave them extra packets for free when Margaret told him about James. "For remembering," he said with a bow, "for continuing." But the real surprise came 3 days later. Sarah had returned to work, carrying Amelia's memory like a stone in her pocket, but finding she could breathe around it now. She was checking her phone during a break when she saw the photo. Margaret had posted to the community garden's Facebook page, the two of them, dirt-smudged and grinning, surrounded by newly planted earth. The caption read, "New friends, old soil, future blooms. Sometimes strangers become family in the space of a conversation. Meet Sarah, who saved me without knowing I needed saving." By evening, the post had been shared 200 times. By the end of the week, it had gone viral, this simple story of two women finding each other in grief, of connection forged in a diner booth and solidified in garden dirt. But more than that, it sparked something. Margaret's daughter called, crying, saying she hadn't realized how isolated her mother had become, asking if she could visit next weekend. Then her sons called too. They made plans, real plans, not just vague promises of sometime soon. Sarah's story touched the parents of her pediatric patients. They organized a memorial garden at the hospital in Amelia's name, and Sarah found herself surrounded by a community she hadn't known existed. Other nurses who'd lost patients, families who'd lost children, all gathering to create beauty from heartbreak. The sunflowers grew 6 feet tall that summer. Margaret and Sarah tended them together every week, and soon others joined them. Mr. Kim brought his granddaughter. Rosa from the diner came on her days off, a veteran who'd known James from the VFW, a young mother whose daughter had been Sarah's patient and survived. The garden became a gathering place, a space where strangers could become neighbors, where loneliness could be transformed into communion. They called it James's Garden, and Margaret cried happy tears the day they hung the sign. On the first anniversary of that rainy night, Sarah and Margaret sat on a bench surrounded by sunflowers, their faces turned toward the late summer light. "Do you think about Amelia?" Margaret asked gently. "Every day," Sarah said. "But now when I think of her, I also think of all the children who lived, all the ones I'll help tomorrow and the day after. And I think of you, and this garden, and how something so painful led to something so beautiful." She took Margaret's hand. "She would have loved the sunflowers. James would have loved you," Margaret replied. They sat in comfortable silence, two women who'd found each other in the darkest moment and chosen, again and again, to show up for each other. Around them, the garden buzzed with life, children laughing, neighbors talking, bees moving from bloom to bloom. That evening, Margaret's children and grandchildren came for dinner, filling her apartment with noise and love and the chaos she'd been missing. Sarah joined them, no longer a stranger but family in the way that matters most. Chosen, treasured, essential. As Margaret looked around her crowded living room, at her daughter helping in the kitchen, her grandchildren sprawled on the floor, Sarah laughing at one of her son's terrible jokes. She felt James's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, not haunting her, but blessing this new chapter of her life. The rain had stopped, and spring had come again. Later, after everyone had left and Sarah was saying goodbye, Margaret pulled her into a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me that night, for sitting down." "Thank you," Sarah whispered back. "For being brave enough to reach out? You saved my life, you know. I was so close to giving up." "We saved each other," Margaret said simply. "That's what people do, if we're lucky enough and brave enough to let them." Sarah walked home through streets damp with evening dew, past the diner where it had all begun, past the hospital where she healed children, past strangers who might need saving or might save someone else, and she understood, finally, what her attending had told her in medical school, that healing isn't always about medicine or miracles, but about showing up, being present, bearing witness to each other's pain and joy. In her apartment, she opened her laptop and began to write. Knowing Amelia's mother would want to know that her daughter's brief, brilliant life had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, touching lives and growing gardens and proving that even in our darkest moments, we're never as alone as we think. The title came to her immediately. Her. Because sometimes one person's courage to reach out, to see another's pain and offer their own broken heart in solidarity, is enough to change everything. And sometimes, on rainy nights in corner diners, miracles look like nothing more than two strangers deciding not to be strangers anymore.